Now take this design by Buck Design. The viewer's journey starts with the bold, large graphics emanating from the bottom right. The angle of these graphics and the position is something we're going to look at later in the video. But on this design, the attention to the viewer moves up to the white heading, which acts as a secondary focus. And that's with a short stop off to the tagline before finally resting on information in the bottom left, which is the logo. Of course, not every single person will view this design in exactly the same way or the same order, but it provides a clear, streamlined path that helps most viewers absorb the message quickly. When you're applying the 3-flow rule, it's helpful to take a step back. I mean, literally take a step back. Look at your design from a distance or shrink it down to a thumbnail size. If the visual path still feels balanced and easy to follow, you've done something right here. But if it feels chaotic or your eye is bouncing around the place, something is probably off. So try adjusting the balance of contrast, spacing, or alignment until your eye naturally travels through the composition in a calm and controlled way. This small habit will train you to see flow on every single project and not just relying on gut instinct. Our eyes naturally follow implied emotion, angles, and gaze lines without even realizing it. And you can use that behavior like we've seen, but we can take full control of how the viewer reads your design by combining it with hierarchy properly. So take this Dazed magazine cover. Now you likely did notice the model's face because it is actually intentionally illuminated in that lovely amber light. But consider which way her face is pointing, up towards the title of the magazine, which is black. Now it could have been white so it stood out against the background, but that's not what the designer intended here. Hierarchy decided you noticed the face first, which started the journey. Designers often frame text close to the direction of the subject's gaze to make sure the reader's eye moves exactly where intended. Angled backgrounds or shapes that point inward can funnel focus towards the center of the layout. Curved compositions or diagonal alignments create natural momentum that keep the eye traveling through the page. Even the positioning of light and shadow can nudge attention from one element to the next. This is where directional hierarchy really comes to life here. The goal isn't to create movement, it's actually to create a path of importance. Each directional cue should serve the hierarchy by leading from the most dominant focal point to the next in order of relevance. The line of sight, the flow of shapes, and the balance of weight all work together to build that sequence in play. And when this is done well, the viewer doesn't just look at your design, they're actually experiencing it in a deliberate order that reinforces the message. Size is one of the easiest ways to create hierarchy because our eyes pick up on the fact of size instantly. The larger an element is, the faster it draws attention, simply put. And to structure visual hierarchy using size, think of it in yet another 3 levels: the hook, the secondary detail, and the finisher. Most designers will say the most important part of your design should always be the largest, and while that's true most of the time, there are situations where it's not true. Now if your design is promoting a product, then yes, the product itself should be the largest element because it's the hero here. Take this drinks advert poster. The bottle is front and center, that's your hook. But also the really switched on designers out there notice the red circle behind it adding more emphasis. But in another case, like an events poster, the hook might be an artistic image or typography, while the most important information could be the date or location. The key is to make the hook the largest visual, the secondary details slightly smaller, and then the smallest text or element could be your call to action where the viewer finishes. Once the viewer is drawn in by that hook, their eyes follow the hierarchy you've built, moving from the secondary details to the finisher, where they absorb the essential information. This approach becomes even more powerful when combined with something like the F or the Z pattern, and that will guide the flow of attention smoothly from start to finish. In the realm of graphic design principles, the very first and most fundamental level of movement and flow is simply directing visual guidance. In our starting poster today, we have a bold headline in the top left, and this is the natural place for the eye to start in the left to right reading cultures. But below that, a large geometric arrow points diagonally down to a secondary block in the bottom right, the CTA. Here, your brain obviously doesn't need instructions. It sees the bold element and then it just follows the arrow instinctively. It doesn't have to be something as stupidly obvious as an arrow though, just something that acts as a bridge or a path as such. This is the most obvious and literal form of movement in graphic design. But why does it work? Well, it works because the human eye instinctively follows directional cues. You'll see it in everything from wayfinding signage in airports, to sports adverts where the athlete's gaze or maybe a part of their body points towards the logo or a specific part of the design. At this level, movement is about raw and obvious clarity. You're telling the eye exactly where to go. Simple and, of course, straightforward. But we are going to steadily move into more advanced teachings in this video with each different level. So once you've mastered simple, basic direction, the next step is to use hierarchy to create a natural flow without relying on arrows or obvious lines. And it's easier to achieve than you might think. So on our poster, I'm adding a medium-sized subheading and a smaller detail at the bottom of it. And the arrow has been completely banished, as you can see. Now, instead of jumping straight from the headline to the CTA at the bottom right, your eye actually stops in the middle before continuing. This happens because of visual weight. Larger, bolder elements are seen first, then medium elements, and then the smaller ones. It's like a gravitational pull where size and contrast dictate order on a graphic design. But the question you might have is, why? Why is this needed, or why is this even a thing? Well, the benefit of hierarchy-driven flow is that it feels effortless. You don't have to draw an arrow because the composition itself creates an invisible one. Think of editorial layouts in magazines, or minimal poster designs where there's no decoration at all, yet your eye on a good design still travels in a deliberate sequence top-down. This is where movement becomes more sophisticated. The viewer doesn't feel directed on a conscious level, but they're still being guided by you, the designer. So at stage 3, we're adding a touch of complexity. Movement doesn't have to be one single journey from point A to point B. You can have multiple flows running at once on a single design, a main route and then smaller micro routes. So zooming into our central section, I'm adding smaller type blocks and elements that pull the eye into a kind of short loop before reconnecting to the main path. This creates a kind of exploration moment. The viewer takes a side road, processes extra detail, and then returns to the main path. It's kind of like fractals in nature, where we have smaller movement and flows within a main movement and flow. The advantage here is time on a design. By giving people more than one visual path, you keep them looking for longer. But of course, this will depend on your brief and what content you've been given to work with. This is just a clear example for you guys today. But the trick is to balance the strength of these secondary flows so they don't overpower the main one. But it can go totally and drastically wrong. Some designers might use too many competing paths, and the design might end up feeling chaotic. But done correctly, layered paths give your work a richness and a depth that actually rewards multiple different viewings. Now, we're currently working on a branding streetwear project, and I'm sure you know that part at the very beginning of a branding project that feels like an uphill marathon. You can start to feel like Thomas Anderson in The Matrix, staring at spreadsheets and data all day long, boxed into a cubicle. Thankfully, instead of waiting for Morpheus to show up, I just handed the entire project to an intern, but an intern from the future. Enter stage right, Skywork AI. And because this intern has no emotional feelings, I can dump the mind-numbing and tedious parts of the research process over to it without any guilt whatsoever. Okay, maybe 5% guilt, and only because I've seen what happens in Terminator. But in Skywork, the tedious phase of my project was handled in one workspace. It researched the market, analyzed competitors, and built a strategy report. But get this, you can download skill packs. And for my project, this marketing psychology one was really useful. This uses behavioral science and cognitive biases to optimize the marketing strategy. So we're talking leveraging principles like anchoring, social proof, and scarcity, all to understand consumer behavior and to boost conversion rates on this project. And look, Skywork has created for me a spreadsheet on my clients' competition, their financials, and so on. And what I found interesting though is that it doesn't stop just there. From the same project, I could have taken those findings and actually had Skywork automatically turn them into presentations with visual slides, initial creative directions already laid out. Here I've taken the research for the industry sector of my brand or my client's brand and just asked Skywork to create a PDF of this combined information. So instead of just bouncing between 5 different tools and 20 browser tabs, the entire workflow stays connected. It stays right here. I of course read through the results myself. I obviously fully absorbed the essence of the brand and so forth, but the process of gathering all of the information didn't feel like something had stolen my soul. And if you would like to try Skywork for yourself, there's a link in the description box of today's video down below. And you can try it for free and use my code for 20% off the annual plan. And thanks to Skywork for sponsoring this part of today's video. Now we get into the psychological side of movement. Implied motion is when a still design makes the viewer feel like something is actually moving in some way. And it happens all the time and it's not difficult to do either. This can be achieved with repetition, progressive scaling, blurring, or even directional patterns. So imagine our poster's background gaining a faint directional pattern that tapers off at one edge. Your brain reads this as acceleration. It could even be something as simple as a gradient from top to bottom with a texture added. Or think about photography in editorial design, a dancer's frozen leap, fabric caught mid-swing, or water splashing around a product shot. Even in brutalist design, you can actually create implied motion with repeated geometric forms, ones that get tighter or looser across a composition. The key here is suggestion. You're not physically moving anything, but you're making the viewer's eye behave as if it is. This is particularly powerful in static media because it makes the design feel more alive without actually using any animation. Now I'm adding a bold, rotated black square with a red motif right across our main flow path. At first, it might look like it's a mistake, something blocking the way here. But that is the point. Your eye hits it, it pauses, and then it has to find its way around it somehow. That pause actually forces re-engagement. Notice how the square is rotated at 45 degrees, and that makes it look even more disjointing compared to the rest of the layout. And that's not a mistake or fluke, it's done intentionally on purpose to add even more disruption. Flow disruption works because the brain doesn't like unresolved paths. If something interrupts the journey, we instinctively try to work it out. Now you can use this to slow the viewer down at key messages or key points, or to make the design feel more dynamic and less predictable. It is a high-level move that requires intention, not done randomly. So if you do it deliberately, it can become a tension point that makes the design more memorable or even allude to a specific point. So at the ultimate stage, movement isn't just about where the eye goes, it's about when the eye goes there and how long for. This is called temporal flow, controlling the rhythm of how long the eye lingers when it accelerates and when it pauses. It is kind of like conducting music, but with visuals. So perfect examples would be in luxury fashion advertising. Think of notorious magazine spreads. You have a full bleed image of a model with a sharp gaze. That's the fast hit. Followed by the layered details like jewelry, fabric, texture, or copy set in fine serif fonts. This is where the eye may slow down and scan a bit. Then a stark white space at the bottom where the logo sits alone. That's the pause. So that sequence forces the viewer through different beats: impact, linger, release. Or take Apple's product pages. The opening hero image hits you hard and fast. Then you slow down on the technical details in clean blocks. That's the slow part, of course. And that's before resting on a vast open white space surrounding a single product. That is the pause. And that rhythm creates a subconscious sense of time within a static design. A viewer doesn't just look at things here, they experience it like beats of music, like I said earlier. Punch, slow, pause, release. The mastery here is kind of like a time-based journey on a design. That's when you've truly mastered flow. But the really key thing here is that something like, 99% of designers don't consider this temporal flow of time. But if you start to consider it on your designs, be it a poster, marketing brochure, website, whatever it is, you will begin to create better experiences for your audience. You are about to watch the most important teachings I've ever shown on this channel about contrast. You'll learn some graphic design theories about contrast and techniques that are not shown anywhere else on YouTube. The first application of contrast is probably the one that most people know about, and that is the contrast of color. This is typically achieved by using colors opposite to each other on the color wheel, and that's because these colors offer the most contrast. However, we can also do things such as have low saturated colors mixed with bright, bold saturated colors, or even grayscale options with color which often emphasizes a sad kind of atmosphere. One of the main ways that contrasting colors is used is on call to action buttons or areas similar to that. It's how social media UI creates an addictive response in the user, or why you've been tricked into buying premium dog food for your pet as opposed to the basic stuff. Next is contrast of size. Essentially, contrast of size is hierarchy, and typically speaking, we could say that the larger things on a design, the designer gives more importance to. And this is even more obvious when these larger objects or assets are sat next to smaller objects, hence contrast. Typically, larger objects on your design will be noticed first by the viewer, and the focal point on a design is often the largest thing. Sat next to similar objects is going to appear dominant and that much more important. Designers often use contrast of size to allude to or emphasize a product that is being advertised. And contrast in size is used when multiple different options are given to something like a sign-up page on a website. The larger option will most likely be clicked simply because of contrast. Now, a pro tip here is to use contrast of size to create surreal or jarring works. And this can be used to captivate audiences and add extra intrigue. And so the third basic way to use contrast before we move on to the more advanced things is typography. And we could say the previous two examples of contrast do actually play into typography when considering contrast. For example, larger typography is contrasted with smaller typography on headlines, subheadings, and in body text. We also sometimes see a contrast of color in typography to make important information stand out, or simply a bolder, thicker font being used. And then we have contrasting typeface styles. This is often used in logo design to create interest and, well, contrast. A logo design simply looks neater if we have contrast in the logo type. So now let's take things a step further and let's get a bit more advanced when using contrast on our graphic designs. So here is a Nike poster, and it is a pretty simple poster, and I personally would prefer some typography on it. But it is a very awesome demonstration of contrast. And for this first exercise, I would like you to look at this poster, look at this design. Can you see the 3 different uses of contrast in this poster? Yeah, that's right. There are 3 different ways contrast is being used here. So let's go over the easiest one first and foremost. We have the contrast of color. As you can see here, the white against the black, or maybe the white against the orangey, pinky color here, peachy color. And that is obvious. It is the first and most obvious one you would probably realize. But what is the second form of contrast on this poster? It is actually shape, the contrast of shape. As you can see here, we have very straight, angled, pointy lines running along the entire poster. They are contrasted with the smooth curvature of the actual shoe and the logo itself. Now, this is somewhat subtle to some people or even unrecognizable, but this allows the shoes, the product in a sense, and also their logo to stand out. Everything else is angled straight line. So that's the second form of contrast here. But can you see the third? So yeah, the third form of contrast is texture. If you look closely here, there's a kind of sandy color blur texture going on the background. That is in complete contrast to the shoe itself, which looks very smooth and realistic. It's a contrasting texture, and again, it just eludes the viewer to looking at the shoe itself. I find it interesting how the designer has put black shoes on a black part of the design. And again, I would personally prefer some typography going on here too. But that's an example of having 3 different forms of contrast on one simple design. Contrast of style isn't something you want to be using on every single design, and the advanced designers know when or when not to use it. On this design here, we see a very minimal, bold and flat design. That is apart from the photographic element of the cockroach. This is a contrast of style, and it can help to create a visual intrigue or highlight an element on your design. The minimal and the flat nature of the design allows the viewer to be drawn into it, and then to actually notice the cockroach more so, which ultimately just enhances its visual impact. Contrast of style can be very subtle, but the trained eye can spot it very easily. As example right here. The designers used very precise technical line style graphics, along with the more cartoony and 3D elements. It's a straight contrast in style, but they work so well together. They could have easily just made these white icons below in a cartoon 3D style as well, but it would not have worked as well as it does here on this design. Now it's time to get a bit touchy-feely and hands-on. Contrast of texture does appear visually appealing, but in graphic design it's often used to express the sensation of touch or detail. For example, here we can see the marker pen textures on a bold and a flat design. This gives the pure illusion of a texture sensation to the viewer. And then here there's a plastic or rubbery balloon texture matched with a flat 2D graphic. Having a contrast of textures emphasizes the important texture, making it have more impact on the design itself. Having the white flat logo in the top left and then the bold graphics around the edges simply helps the texture of the balloon itself become more obvious when viewed. Now as designers, we can even use contrast of psychology on our work, and when it's done properly, it's a very powerful thing indeed. To achieve this, you first need to understand psychology of graphic design so you can then twist and manipulate it in your work. For example, we can say that a serif typeface is well matched with luxury and exclusivity, and it's used to express those connotations psychologically speaking to the viewer. Well, we can actually see here that a serif typeface is used in a very different setting and situation, and that goes against the norm and is a contrast of psychological beliefs. On this second design, normally we would assume an urban hip-hop visual narrative to use a bold sans serif typeface. Instead, we see a very narrow serif typeface. So again, that's contrasting of psychology. But what about this skull design? How has the designer used contrast of psychology here? Well, it's actually a very clever design when inspected deeply. Skulls are normally thought of as negative and represent death, of course. But the design uses bright, bold, uplifting colors, matched with a very playful yellow font. This makes the design seem playful and happy, which totally goes against the symbolism of what skulls are. Designers can use this method to express a message, an idea, or even an emotion on their work. And actually, emotion brings us swiftly onto the next point in today's video. Check out this design here for the British National Health Service. How might the contrast of emotion be used on this design? So this design aims to raise awareness of smoking around children, which of course is just a very serious thing. But the design then uses humor to get the message across, and furthermore to make it memorable and relatable to the viewer. And on this movie poster here, we see a juxtaposition of love and sadness to reflect the film's bittersweet narrative. Also, there's a crack on the ice that suggests something is not right in the situation. Again, more contrast. But what about UI and UX designers? How can we implement contrast in professional and powerful ways on those kind of designs? So here is a design of an app, or just a layout of an app. There are many different forms of contrast going on here, and I would like you to try and work out and decipher what is going on in terms of contrast. So when you actually pick apart designs in this way, you can then start to think about your own work and how you can apply principles on your own graphic designs. So the first form of contrast is here, with these black labels that clearly stand out all over the app. They do this by standing out in just terms of black contrast on color or white. But one very important use of contrast is found here and in other areas of the app. We not only have different contrasting font choices font weights, but also font colors, which allude to a very important part that the designer wants to bring an attention to. That's why you always see for sale signs in red or a contrasting color, because contrasting, like I said at the start of the video, does draw attention in very easy ways. But what other contrast elements can you see? Now this area, and all of these areas in fact, are kind of a double whammy when it comes to contrast. Now firstly, the app background is white or grey, but then these areas are in a bold, bright colour section, so they obviously stand out. But then also, if you think about it, the photographs themselves are contrasting. I mean, we have red on blue, we have blue on orange, kind of bluey, turquoisey on pink, and so on. So there's quite a lot of contrast going on in these areas. But can you see anything else that's contrasting in this design? Yes, the actual UI itself is contrasting the UI of the app or even the phone. We have a red dots here, and also up here. Next, something that will totally help reinvent or upscale your work when talking about contrast, and that is contrast of concepts. So here's a concept for a tech-inspired poster design. And actually, it's not very inspired though, is it? I mean, the concept is 2D, it's flat, it is very lackluster. Now, if you totally contrast this style, we can start with a more 3D approach and bring on some still 2D typography, but keep in line with the modern sans serif style. Also, then of course, the body text. And that's contrasted in size and also type style, much like we looked at earlier in today's course video. And then at the very foot of the design, we can bring on the date and contrast that in size, color, and also, again, type style. So considering we contrasted the original design's concept, we now have a more minimal, a more 3D and modern design, and this makes the original template-esque design look lesser in terms of quality. But then take a look at this design here, a poster for a kind of menu or restaurant. We have some lovely salmon on a rustic board, some bold typography, and then of course the pricing. The former concept is cheaper, more hectic, and more slapdash, if you will. However, it is important to consider the brief and the target audience for both designs, because both of these designs could actually have a time and a place depending on that target audience. If you want to learn some more great tips about graphic design, maybe some tips on a different principle, just click the video on screen. But until next time, guys, design your future today. Peace.